if I told you, let's design a diet that induces depression in somebody and also increases their risk of Alzheimer's, other neurodegenerative diseases, what would that diet look like?
It would look a lot like the diet that some people are eating on an average day of American food. You wake up and first of all, you're going to have caloric excess. You're going to have some breakfast cereal, maybe low-fat yogurt, might still be in that kind of low-fat, trying for low calories, but not eating really satiating foods kind of mindset. There is going to be a lot of processed food, right? So you're going to experience a lot of intense flavors, a lot of sweetness, a lot of saltiness, this nice palatability of fats and sugars. The rest of the day could be some snacking, some ultra-processed food, some fast food, nice burger and fries. It's a great study that came out, Dhru, a couple of years ago now about fried foods. And the people who eat the most fried foods had an increased correlational risk of anxiety. This is a large UK biobank study. And it was kind of showing what some of the new nutritional psychiatry studies are looking like, where they find this correlation. And then the researchers is like, what is it about Western food that makes people have more anxiety? And they said, there's this signal in fried foods. And so they created an animal model. It was a zebrafish model where they found they took acrylamide, which is this byproduct when you make French fries.
Especially when things get like really charred.
Yeah, exactly. Acrylamide is a byproduct of this Maillard reaction anytime you're sort of heating up fats and proteins. And so acrylamide to these zebrafish ended up really disrupting their behavior. Zebrafish tend to pool together, they'd be curious, and they kind of go explore stuff. When they'd put new things in the tank, the zebrafish would just kind of move around chaotically. They wouldn't pool together. And the researchers kind of took this as an indication that, it seems like these are more anxious, more depressed zebrafish. They don't want to partner together. They don't want to explore. They're not as confident. They don't want to work together and connect. So who knows? But a lot of fried foods. And when you compare that, like what is a French fry compared to an oven roasted potato or even a potato in an air fryer? When you oven roast a potato with some olive oil, you reduce acrylamide by 95% in the data I've seen. So that's an example. Lots of fried food. You're going to probably start to get a little schlumpy. So let's hit you with a few energy drinks in the afternoon. Not that it's horrible to have a little energy type of drink maybe early in the afternoon, but I really think people should go coffee, tea, simple, lots of antioxidants, lots of data that it helps. And so as you're seeing, you're also, I want people to think about the colors I'm describing. It's beige. It's not full of all these vibrant colors that we want to see in your diet. It's not these basics of nutritional psychiatry. I have my little rhyme: seafood, greens, nuts and beans, and a little dark chocolate, which I think people remember from the last time I was on. I'm just thinking about what are these food categories that are really nutrient dense, that have the most calories that we need for our mental health.
Yeah. And I think that, when a lot of people listen to that, they probably know a couple people in their world who are eating a diet that looks not too dissimilar from what you've described. And, people today are feeling, regardless of what side of, if you're an informed person in wellness and you care about wellness, it kind of feels like a national emergency. It's like, whoa, our society is being set up in a way that we're kind of poisoning ourselves. And nobody's really talking about, except for a few people, nobody's really talking about like just how bad this is. Do you feel that way at all?
I feel that we're not maybe talking enough how bad it is. I guess I feel more that on an individual level, we're having a hard time taking individual actions today. I think that in Healing the Modern Brain, I get into the first tenet is self-awareness, and I get into the notion of externalization. And what you're talking about is I think, true. That we are set up that the cheapest calories, right, are the worst for us. That just to get by and feed your family, boy, when you do something that, in my mind, as a parent and as a physician, is a nice move in the beginning of the day, which is to have some eggs. Until recently, that's been a pretty economical move. Dozen eggs used to be $5. That's filled with controversy for a lot of people. right? The idea that you're going to go and again, have a simple 70-calorie egg, perfect protein, nice way to start the day.
What's controversial about that?
Well, I think controversial is that this is traditionally a food that's been thought to be high cholesterol or high saturated fat that tend to be avoided. I think that eggs were one of those foods that's always been kind of lambasted, right, in a certain way in the science. Eggs are also one of those foods that I think everyone should always be suspicious if all of us are only citing one study. What study besides the Harvard egg study does anyone talk about when it comes to eggs and risk? Until recently, there weren't really any. And then as we get a little bit more mature data about including eggs in the diet, I think the most recent data, they look pretty good. And so I'll just say, are we being set up? I think so in a certain way. That's where some of the motivation for this book comes from, is to get out of that stance a bit and think about, how are you contributing to that? Are you walking into Walmart and buying garbage? Are you walking into Walmart and buying wild salmon, pesto, anchovies, kefir? All the best brain foods are right there. I don't mean to mention Walmart. It could be Costco, it could be any big box store. But the idea that, the setup, I think the setup in part is misinformation and lack of knowledge. And then I think the setup in part, and we see this so often, I love these inspirational stories. I see these all the time in my practice where people can take control of their health. They do. It radically shifts. Right? You aren't eating plants. You start eating more plants, more fermented foods. Right? Your health starts to shift. Almost always when people do one of these tenets, you start moving your body a little bit more. It's almost, you can't do that without starting to care more about your nutrition. Boy, once you care about your nutrition and you're moving your body more, you're going to probably sleep better tonight, is my guess. That's what all the data seems to suggest. Now you're moving your body. Boy, your risk of depression just plummeted. And if you have depression, you've just engaged in an activity that's equal to the antidepressant Zoloft at 18 months in high quality trials. So there's a way these tenets kind of begin to inform one another. And are we being set up? Is it a pathogenic culture by which you can end up with severe mental health problems if you don't take certain steps? Yeah, I think so. I think everybody probably agrees. We end up eating, again, lots of processed food, having all of our relationships on the screen or digitally. If we don't think about our connections in the modern world, if you don't think about your connections really in your lifespan as you're aging, how I think about my relationships now in my 50s is very different than I thought about things in my 20s. So continuing to engage in these tenets, I hope gives people this framework like we have for physical fitness. Because you ask people, we all know what we should be doing, right? Everybody knows like exercises for their core. We want to make our biceps big, right? Or we want to work on our endurance or our flexibility. There are all these kind of categories when it comes to physical health. When it comes to our mental health, I find we don't have as much. There's not really the same kind of robust notion of, hey, a couple times a week, like 3 or 4, or I argue every day, just like your physical health, in some way you want to pay attention to it, check in with your body and work on it. You want to do the same thing with your mental health. You want to create a framework for yourself of mental fitness. And I think that allows us to be more insulated around the mental health challenges that may come our way. You look at the statistics, all of us are going to deal with mental health challenges at some point in our life. And then also, if you're in a mental health challenge of some type, these give you things to focus on that are under your control. Everything in the book, all of these tenets, the most part, they're free. They're things that we can do.
I think a lot of people are at home scratching their heads and thinking, why are so many people having such difficulties with their brain? And why are so many of these mental health disorders on the rise? You mentioned there's a whole spectrum of them: autism, Alzheimer's, neurocognitive issues, and everything else in between. Depression, which takes a huge toll on our economy and the lives of people. When somebody comes to you and they ask you, why are people's brains so messed up in this modern day and age? How do you answer the question?
Our brains are changing. We just learned that there's a teaspoon of plastic in our brain. Not sensational science from the corners of the wellness world, like in nature, a teaspoon. So our brains have never had a teaspoon of plastic in them before. Just explain that for people that are not familiar. You're talking about microplastics and some recent studies. So sorry. There's a big study came out in Nature, really one of our most respected scientific journals, looking at microplastics, nanoplastics, these very small plastic molecules, and finding there is a lot of that stuff in our brain. They estimated about a teaspoon. It's throughout our body. We don't know exactly what that does. There's some basic bench science that it can trigger more inflammation. There's a concerning a correlation between people who had dementia having more plastic in their brain. But I think it's an example of there's something new and there are clear steps. In our household for the last 20 years, we've tried to heat nothing in plastic. We don't have a lot of plastic. There wasn't science that plastic was bad. It just seemed, I don't know, like something that was kind of new and that was a little concerning based on some of the data I was seeing. Even back my first book in 2011, The Happiness Diet, we went through a list of, it's a chapter that got cut on toxins. And all of these plasticizers were known concerning chemicals back then. It was like, 15 years ago at this point. So when we talk about what's changed, there's more weird stuff in our environment, not to fearmonger, but just to kind of be more clear. You can't kind of go around the world right now, just kind of living your life, doing what everyone's doing. You're going to end up doom scrolling, eating mostly processed foods, getting lots of microplastics in your diet, getting lots of flame retardants. I mean, there's all kinds of kind of icky stuff out there. So what's changed? Some of that relates to mental health risk. Like, why are there more mental health disorders now? One is more awareness. The other are environmental changes. The modern brain never had to deal with doom scrolling before. It's a very compelling, algorithm-driven, visually stimulating, intellectually stimulating device that we have. So,
what do you think is worse, doom scrolling or microplastics for the brain?
I think microplastics are probably worse for the brain because doom scrolling, you can over time curate your feed. You can get rid of apps. The difference between doom scrolling through a curated feed of like lots of mental health advice and good stuff that inspires you versus, the stuff that you tend to get fed. I think both of them are concerning. And the idea right now is, hey, everybody amidst all of that, that feeling like, oh no, it's overwhelming. Like, what do we do about our mental health? I think let's be realistic. Mental health rates are going up. Right. When I finished training in 2004, 8% of teens had clinical depression. Today, 20% of teens have clinical depression. So something is radically shifted. There are some really clear suspects in this. In some ways, the 9 tenets come from that. I go over these factors that have changed. Look at the sleep of a teenager today versus 20 years ago. Look at the dietary and nutritional quality of food for a teen today compared to 20, 25 years ago. It's just radically shifted. And so has, some of these foundational parts of our self-esteem, like how we relate to people, how we connect with people. I'm not trying to say everything in the modern world is bad. I just think with a modern brain in the modern world, there's a new set of rules, there's a new set of science, and we've got to employ that if we're going to optimize our mental health.
I want to come back to the microplastics conversation because it's a hot topic right now, right? So many people are becoming more aware of it. Any other couple things that you do to protect your body and brain from microplastic exposure? So you already talked about one, that's a no-brainer. Don't microwave in plastic. Don't put foods that have been heated in plastic, right? Anything else that you do?
For sure. I got rid of all my fancy teas and tea bags. I was really disappointed and upset. And I think, again, it's one of those things, nobody meant to do this. But when you get those fancy nylon tea bags, they're coated in microplastics. I saw an estimate, I think it was 2 billion particles of microplastics. Compare that to a paper tea bag or compare that to loose leaf tea where you're not getting any microplastics. So again, same great idea. Have a cup of tea in the afternoon, mellow out, have some chamomile, have some mint. Right? Just wonderful kind of wellness tip, I think, for all of us. Take a breath. And the idea that in doing that simple act, you were poisoning yourself with microplastics. It's just, again, one of those lessons from the modern world that we don't want to fearmonger, but it's like, hey, you got to shift your tea bags. Everybody listening, go see what you have. So I think that's one of certainly the lessons. There was a great article by my favorite psychiatrist, David Puder, who's the psychiatry and psychotherapy podcast host. They just published it in Genomics, looking at how do you get rid of microplastics. And there's not a lot of data, but there was one study where more of this plasticizer BPA would come out in the sweat. And so some question of maybe more saunas is, again, a way to kind of get it out. Because the idea of, okay, we want to limit exposure, right? So you're not getting as much. Then over time, your body naturally clears everything bad. And that's kind of generally true. But are there things we can do to promote it? And so maybe sauna is a way to do that.
Yeah, I love that. I know Dr. Rhonda Patrick has also talked about broccoli sprouts, which have a high concentration of sulforaphane inside of them, which helps sort of the natural detoxification process.
Yeah, sulforaphane and all those sulfur-containing, cruciferous vegetables. People tend to feel that they, can be very helpful. They have a little data actually that sulforaphane or quercetin kind of ramps up some liver detoxification enzymes, and so generally your body is very good at detoxifying stuff. And I'm a big fan of getting ahead of things. Let's limit exposure. Other things, plastic cutting boards. I think being really mindful of the types of a lot sort of meats, fats, and dairy that you're eating, in the sense that these compounds tend to concentrate in, at least in some of the studies, in things like seafood, which is, again, one of my top brain food recommendations. So what do we do about that? In some ways, the same advice we've had for a long time about seafood. We want to get younger, smaller fish. So more tinned fish like sardines, anchovies, smaller fish. Why? They have less environmental exposure, so they're accumulating less microplastic. You get less exposure.
Yeah, that's great. And I think we didn't cover the basics, but a good water filter at home, right? Good reverse osmosis water filter, if you can get it. There's a bunch of great brands that are out there. And then also something interestingly that I've been seeing is that a lot of microplastics spread through the air. And so if you get new furniture, or if you get nylon rugs or other things, if you can splurge a little bit and get a good quality air filter, that's super helpful.
Very helpful. Really good point. All of my clinical rooms, because I spend a lot of time sitting in the same room, in my bedroom, they all have HEPA air filters in them. I mean, a couple $100, and important to change the filter. Also something I find that people don't do. But again, one of these recommendations that, again, as a psychiatrist, wasn't the kind of thing that we used to talk about. Hey, you should filter your air. Hey, let's talk about your food. Hey, let's think about microplastic exposure. Not to overwhelm people, but to make sure that as we are engaging in treatment, as we're taking steps forward, that we're not missing kind of some of this new obvious stuff that's in the science. That's just taking a huge toll when you add it all up on our overall mental health. You want to know, why are the rates going up? And so I think all of these things that I bring up in the book, all of these tenets, they seem to impact risk, right? You look at something like insomnia, not sleeping. So one of the tenets is good sleep, of course. You have a 10 to 17 times increased risk of having depression or another mental health disorder when you have insomnia. You can't ignore that data. Especially, again, if, like a lot of us, you're feeling a little toll on your mental health. You're wanting to do more. With our physical fitness, we all have a lot to do, and I think we all have maybe some guilt. I was really proud I rode my bike to this recording session here. Just a great way to start the day, but also just, I don't know, helping me achieve one of my goals, get some oxygen, extra blood flow to my brain. Those types of things, engaging in movement, engaging in good sleep, they really add up over time, and I think make a big impact, as everyone knows, on our mental health.
If you had to rank some of these tenets that you talk about, and even the subtenets underneath them, if you had to rank food, environmental toxins, sleep, and a sedentary lifestyle, let's just start with those four.
Okay.
Right? So food, environmental toxins, environmental exposure, sleep, and sedentary lifestyle for the patient set that kind of comes to you, even though every person is different. What do you see as being the top one, and then take us from there? Generalizing to our population, what's taking the number one toll on our population and our mental health today?
I would say the top risks of the ones that you just described probably is sleep. When you don't sleep well, you're not cleaning out the waste in your brain. You're not really processing all the complex emotions that we're having. You're not consolidating memory. So some of that brain fog, just not feeling your best, low mood, I kind of put sleep there as fundamental. It's hard for me to decide between sleep and nutrition, Dhru, because they're so biologically foundational, right? Nutrition this is what your brain is made of. You've got a diet with a lot of magnesium or not. You've got a diet with a lot of omega-3 fats and fiber or not. And so those two are really hard for me to differentiate between in terms of, again, these foundational pieces.
Part of what I'm hearing you say is also, if your sleep is messed up, that might be number one for you.
You've got to get sleep on. They teach us in psychiatry residencies, the most dangerous thing is when someone is not sleeping. If your patients are sleeping, it's okay, you can sleep. But if your patients are sleeping, like, you've got to be very concerned. The risk, and I think everybody listening, and Dhru, you know too, the risk is quite severe, especially, I don't know how other people experience this so much, but for me at 2 a.m. when I have insomnia, my brain is in a very strange place chemically. I tend to be more catastrophic. I tend to have a lot more negative thinking, not all the time, but frequently. It's not a time that I like being awake with my brain, to be honest. And so I think for a lot of people, when you begin to have mental health symptoms, when you begin to not sleep, it's also a time when we tend to ruminate, right? So that notion that now we're up, we're ruminating, we're having negative thoughts. So along with all the neurobiological part, we're not cleaning out waste, right? We're not engaging in all these, very important kind of healing processes that are going on in the brain during sleep. There's also just encountering the psychology of being with ourselves in not kind of the best state. And so I think those things certainly contribute. You said, nutrition, as I said, it's just, 70% of the calories most people eat come from ultra processed foods. And so we say that word a lot. And I just think that that's food that isn't simply prepared. If you're processing it with a chef's knife or, your blender, okay, that's great. But these foods that are made of food products, as so many of your guests have talked about, are really at the center of the problem that we're having when you look at the statistics of these basic fundamental nutrients for mental health, like fiber, like folate, like vitamin E, and the majority of Americans aren't getting them every day. And then the point I often like to make, and that was very important for me as a physician, we don't know where to get them. Everybody likes to debate which type of magnesium to take. Is it glycinate or is it citrate? But I find very few people know what their favorite magnesium food is or their top 5. And I think it's really important that we translate this knowledge about nutrition into our everyday choices with nutrition. You mentioned environmental toxins. And so I think that probably depends on exposure. Certainly some people listening, if you've had a lot of environmental toxin exposure, that might really be the top thing going on. I'm probably of the camp that it is the minority of people struggling with their mental health problem, that it comes directly from a singular toxin. There's certainly certain examples of that in the literature and kind of in the world. But there are certainly a few classic examples. Someone gets mercury poisoning, but it's not so clear that, hey, you get a bunch of microplastics and the next day you're depressed. Other than the number one environmental toxin, of course, out there, Dhru, that is just lurking, totally destroying America's health, which is alcohol. And that certainly is the number one environmental toxin, that if they're, for all of the talk of microplastics and mercury and mold and all this other stuff, it's like, no, the number one problem in America when it comes from toxins or comes to toxins is certainly alcohol. It's just a bane on our society.
Yeah. I want to talk about nutrition a little bit more. What would you say let's talk about this idea that you address in the book. And it's that idea, some people might be familiar with it, that this whole idea of a chemical imbalance is a complete myth.
Well, I wouldn't say I put it exactly like that. I think it's all chemicals up there, Dhru. It's all molecules.
But that a chemical imbalance is the root of all depression. And once that chemical balance of a single chemical or a couple little chemicals
for sure
is addressed, then the depression goes away.
We need to understand the chemical imbalance theory came from an idea that depression and mental health disorders really primarily exist in the brain. And that when we change chemicals in the brain, when you give someone MDMA or when you give them Prozac, you're shifting chemicals in the brain. I think that's very true. I think what isn't helpful in what a lot of patients experience is that simply getting on a medication doesn't get them all the way better. We know antidepressants work for maybe 60% of people. Well, 40% of people aren't getting a benefit then. That's a lot of people. What we want to move away from, I think, is a simple theory that depression is just one thing. Because I think we then approach it that, first of all, you wait until you're really depressed.
And
right?
that one thing being serotonin.
Yeah, serotonin is great, but serotonin is like Madonna in the 90s. Okay? I've listened to a lot of other music. I like Madonna, classic, great, really important, just like serotonin, really important neurotransmitter. Anybody who's saying that serotonin isn't involved in depression or mental health, I don't think has been in the mental health world. I mean, I give antidepressants that modulate serotonin every day. And you see things happen very quickly with people in terms of their symptoms, in terms of their experience of the world. And so a lot of what we're seeing right now, I think in the controversy around serotonin, one, there are a lot of people talking who probably shouldn't be because they don't prescribe these medications, they haven't taken these medications, or they've had limited experiences. Now, if you take a medicine and you have a horrible experience of it, of course, your generalized notion is like, oh, this is a bad thing. When you're in my position, as a lot of clinicians are, where you see a lot of different people take these medicines, you get very humble very quickly because you see they work profoundly well for some people, like life-saving. And you see for other people, they don't help at all. And it's really confusing. And it, again, gets right to this idea of it's not one thing. If you come to me and you have profound inflammation, you had a horrible development, all kinds of development and neglect, you just went through a divorce and you're drinking too much. Is that a serotonin problem? I mean, serotonin's involved in your mood, but when we think about how to address that clinically, it's not like the only thing I say is like, got to get that serotonin up. Right? It's a much more complex clinical process of what we engage in with patients. And so I think what I wanted to address, because it has bothered me, is there's this kind of gotcha notion that psychiatry has been totally off base and that antidepressants and SSRIs have no efficacy and they shouldn't be involved in the story. And that's just not true in the data. What is also clear, though, is we've got to do more than have a mental health system where all we think about when it comes to a psychiatrist is that all I've got for you is a med. Because that's not true. I'm a psychotherapist. I sit and talk with patients. I mean, mental health professionals sit and talk with patients more than any other field in medicine. And I think we need to honor more around it's not just serotonin and medications aren't the only intervention we have, but we do need to be aware that there's so much stigma around those that most people aren't probably getting the right care or an ability to approach and kind of appreciate how those medicines can or can't help them. That's, I think, the main problem we're having.
Was there this idea that one of the ways these medications work, in addition to serotonin, is that they lower brain inflammation?
Well, there are a couple. So for sure, Prozac, I talk about this in the book. Prozac, our prototypical SSRI, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor antidepressant, is a powerful central anti-inflammatory. So again, the same crowd often that's talking about how awful Prozac is also talking about how we want to get rid of inflammation. One of the ways we get rid of inflammation in the brain, some of the antidepressants are great anti-inflammatories. The other thing that some of these medications do, and probably a bit of a final common pathway for a lot of our interventions, is how they affect neuroplasticity. And so the idea that, you see these sound bites that just sort of frustrate me, like there's not a serotonin deficiency in the brain. It's like that, or it's not a Prozac deficiency in the brain. And it just kind of speaks to not having a very nuanced kind of sense of some of these medications are triggering receptors, right, that then lead to an increase in neuroplastic processes. You get more BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And so, again, they don't work for everybody, but when they work, it's really impressive. And I'd probably argue in the history of medicine, find a medication class, one that's been as scrutinized as SSRIs, two that's been as effective in treating, something that never historically has been treated. Right? In the history of the human race, we've never really done a good job taking care of our mental health, ever. Everyone's had depression throughout, or there's been depression throughout history, but this is really the first time we have something that, one, we have all these lifestyle factors we're talking about in the book. They have a lot of evidence behind them that help our mental health. And then two, when you need more treatment, we know more about these medicines. We know more about what are effective evidence-based interventions than ever before. So it's like a better time than ever before to have mental health problems. I think where I get frustrated is there's this notion of we've been wrong for 35 years. And I was like, I don't think any psychiatrist out there that I know who's trained in the modern world thought it was all about serotonin. Like that idea of a chemical imbalance is to help people think it's not because you're an awful person. It's because there are some things going on, a mix of your environment, a mix of your genetics, and then probably an expression of your epigenetics, how your genes get played, that's really underlying your mood state. And let's try and address that given all the tools we have.
I think that one of the feelings that is there is that I came across this, we're writing about it on Friday, I believe. There was this review paper by Nicholas Fabiano. Do you know him? Mm-hmm. He's like with the metabolic psychiatry sort of work that's there. Canadian physician. And it was basically like, here's the prescription for working out, right? Like if you were going to hand a prescription to working out to a patient, and in the opening in that review paper, we'll link to it in the show notes on the podcast, it was basically talking about, and you talked about this too, is that physical activity and getting somebody out of a sedentary lifestyle is as effective as talk therapy. Not that it's about, hey, either or. It's as effective as talk therapy based on all the review of the data that's out there. And it can be as effective as, an SSRI for depression. It was all about what is the relationship between physical activity and depression. And I think, again, this goes back to a larger idea, what you're saying about foods, is that nobody ever told you which foods have magnesium in them. You might have learned that magnesium is important, but nobody ever told you how important it was. And nobody told you definitely what foods to be getting them from. So I think when people feel and have their criticisms on SSRIs and there's no serotonin deficiency in the brain, partly what I'm seeing that's there, and anything can be taken to the extreme, is that nobody really sat down and told the patient like, hey, physical activity actually could be a first line response. And that obviously plays into this whole idea, well, doctors don't have that much time. How much are they genuinely educated in that? And, and also patients genuinely a lot of times want a quick fix. Most of them are not going to be in a position where they're even being shown that this is a particular option that they should put a lot of, weight into.
Yeah, I think it's a good point also that people sometimes don't have the time or resources. It all sounds great. Start eating leafy greens and seafood, start working out, 150 minutes of exercise once a week. When you're a busy parent with a job and you're depressed, that sounds great. It's really hard to do. And I think, when we talk about kind of like a quick fix, I think that when we think about nuanced, stigma-free mental health care, which is the system that we need to move towards, where we do more preventatively to care for our mental health, we have more options available. It would be really great right now if all generic psychotropic medications were free to all Americans. That would really help with the major problem we're having in terms of the efficiency of our economy, right? The top drag on our economy is clinical depression by far, which is very clear. Mental health disorders are really what is the top cause of disability in America. And so when we think about, okay, well, what can we do? Boy, there's some low-hanging fruit. You know what a lot of us did over the last 2 years, Dhru? After all of this training, I spent a significant amount of my week feeling like a drug dealer, because my patients and I'd have to call around to the pharmacies to try and find who had a formulation of a stimulant, because they'd been well treated for years and now their meds are gone. No one really explained, why did the stimulant supply to America get cut off for about a year and a half?
I'm not familiar with this. Why? What happened?
Oh, I'm not sure. I was busy trying to find it for my patients.
So you're saying that somebody who was taking maybe an SSRI all of a sudden couldn't get that drug?
Yeah, not SSRIs so much. That happens sometimes. It happened more with Wellbutrin in the past, but more with Adderall, the psychostimulants. And so we've seen this kind of huge surge in an interest in people pursuing or thinking about that some of what they're struggling with is maybe not depression, but is ADHD. So there's been an increase in diagnosis of ADHD. Treatments for ADHD, organizational therapy really helps quite a bit, but oftentimes people end up taking stimulants. And the stimulant supply in America just got kind of totally disrupted. Totally.
Is it because of this whole telehealth revolution where there's all these new startups that are basically, you don't even have to see a doctor. They just fill out an intake form, and then now all of a sudden this person's getting it.
Not at all. I think it's because that our medication supply hasn't been protected. I mean, if you have millions of people who are taking a medicine, they're engaged in treatment, it's working, and then those medicines aren't available, and it's so stigmatizing too, Dhru. I mean, if you're an executive and suddenly you're calling around to pharmacy, hey, do you guys have Adderall? Hey, do you have Ritalin? And so that's improved. But I just, and I don't mean to get onto a tangent, it's just it's one of those things when it comes to really taking mental health seriously, there are just some things that we could do that would be very helpful, giving people better access to medications when they need them, giving people better access to some of what we're talking about. There's no way for me to prescribe exercise. There are some states where I can prescribe food. And so a lot of where we have the mental health system that we do is that there really aren't some of the capacities that we would hope for to really help people engage. Again, if you're really depressed, if you have a men's group that shows up and is like, hey man, like, let's go for a walk, let's go for a run. We know you're feeling down. For sure, you're going to go on a walk or a run with those guys. It's like easy peasy. Without that, some people, but it's very hard again to get motivated.
It's very hard to get motivated. I know that there's, so many of my family, being Indian, like, is in the medical field. Many doctors and even people who aren't doctors, executives in the space, other stuff. These are people who genuinely care. And it's okay to criticize a system and say that through lack of awareness, things just don't get priority, right? So there's a lot of people that listen to this podcast who have shared with me that, they've gone to their doctor. Like, you're in a completely different space, but they've gone to their psychiatrist. And things have definitely changed in the last couple years, but most people are going to their doctor and they've heard that food has nothing to do with their depression, right? That's a common thing that is regularly shared with people that's out there, right? So I don't want to let people off the hook who are even still good intentioned, is that yes, you can still be a caring human being, good intention, but you actually have no clue. You have no training, you have no clue, you have no awareness about the fact that actually, people can eat, French fries a few times a week and literally feel more depressed, and that there is a connection that's there.
Yeah. I think you're also talking about how sometimes the field doesn't update itself quickly enough. Now nutrition is in the WHO depression treatment guidelines, really all of the major depression treatment guidelines, really through the work of Felice Jacka and her crew, the Mood and Food Academy at Deakin University in Australia. Felice is probably our top Felice is the top nutritional psychiatry researcher in the world. And she has worked so hard to make sure that our standards for treatment include nutrition and exercise. So I would say any clinician who's not saying, hey, one, at least in forming alliance, tell me your thoughts about how food relates to your mental health. Because what I hate is when patients are interested in something, hey, I really think my food is contributing to my anxiety. And you hear stories where clinicians shut that down.
It happens all the time.
I think it does.
Happens in cancer, happens in, depression, so many different categories.
I think part of that is we have a healthcare system that isn't based around food. Most doctors get some training on food. I still argue, we can see this criticism, 26 hours of nutrition education for the average physician in America. I do like to point out that's 26 hours of medical school education, which is pretty complex. That's on top of a year of biochemistry. And that's a lot of training. It often gets criticized, like doctors have no training in nutrition, but that 26 hours is a lot of lectures, especially again at a graduate medical level. So, and again, I think things are shifting. I finished my medical degree 25 years ago. So things have shifted. There are more and more medical schools now with culinary medicine curriculums. I think there are more doctors than ever who are curious about this. I think there's more excitement and engagement, for example, in lifestyle medicine, which really focuses on things like nutrition and sleep. So, and then I think what you're talking about sometimes is where people have a mismatch with their clinician and they don't do anything about it. And not everybody has the privilege and the freedom to choose their doctor. But if you do, and you're in a situation like Dhru describes where you're not feeling listened to, kind of, again, to get away from the externalization of you got to change your doctor. You've got to find somebody who's going to engage with you in the way where you feel supported in your journey to health. It's one of my favorite things about being a psychiatrist. I get to treat people of all kinds of different values and backgrounds, and my job is to take good care of them, not to judge their values. And so, you want to have a good fit with your clinical team when you have, especially when you have mental health concerns, because that really, when we look at all the data, trying to understand, for example, what psychotherapy works the best. The data tends to tell us it's when there's a good fit, someone who has good training and a good sense of psychotherapy in terms of on the clinical side, but also that you feel a good fit, you feel safety, and that you're in a place where you can express yourself and not be judged.
Coming back to these core tenets, you've been in this space for a long time. You have talked about the power of food throughout many of your books, on your podcasts, on social media. Was there anything new in the category of food that you incorporate in this book that you thought, man, this is something that people, it may not be completely new, but it's not something that people are putting as much attention on? Food, supplementation, any other kind of novel component that was even for a little bit for you as you're researching the book and putting together, saying, man, people might know this, but they're not giving as much attention to it.
There were a couple things in food, Dhru. What really blew me away was in some of the other tenets, to be very honest. In fact, I brought this journal for you. This is for you, a little moose journal.
Nice.
And I'd love you to fill that up with all of your deep middle-aged male thoughts. The data, for example, on journaling, the research on what's called affective labeling is striking. When we engage in journaling, we increase the activity of our frontal lobes, the part of our brain that's involved in executive functioning, getting stuff done, making decisions. Again, part of our brain that for a lot of people we're struggling with all of this kind of overwhelm. And so again, a simple idea of carving out some time to write to yourself. I particularly encourage people to write about powerful feelings, struggles. Try to kind of get to a point, get to what you're trying to tell yourself, kind of like we do in a good psychotherapy session. It all adds up to something in a good session.
Is there a framework, or you just want people free journaling?
I put some different prompts in the book. I'm an old school psychiatrist, and I just want to hear what's on your mind, raw, just like one thought to the next. And so I'm a big fan of just get it out on the page, really, as raw as you can. That doesn't work for everybody. I think I've had a lot of therapy and I've spent a lot of time journaling. So if you're new to it, we have some prompts in the book, things, thinking about some of your goals, thinking about fears, thinking about aspects of yourself that you're struggling with, or aspects of yourself you want to be kinder about. And so, certainly there are all kinds of also directed journals. There are journals that have a lot more prompts or that are set up in a way. I really encourage people in the book to experiment, and as opposed to there being kind of one way or one prompt, to try and figure out how you can get in the habit of self-reflection and get in the habit of more self-awareness around your emotional states, where they come from and what they mean. And so in terms of what was like new for me in the book was seeing all of the science behind some of these mental fitness activities that over the years I've seen really work for my patients. Things like going out in nature. The idea that just going out in nature and walking is what I did last night. I flew in and I got right out to the beach. Just had to get out there and just kind of feel the universe for a little bit, settle down for a little bit. Really does a lot for me in my mental health. When you look at the data on, just getting out into nature one time does profound things. It really shifts your brain. Or when you look at even just people seeing more green space, right? Settles things down in our nervous system. Really kind of cool. So I would say those types of things, or in forests. I always love going into forests. I always feel like something settles down. There are actually these molecules we inhale, phytocides, which kind of activate and improve our immune system. So again, I think probably, Dhru, when you asked like what surprised me, there's a little bit in the nutrition chapter. I get into ketogenic diets a little bit. There's some data there that's new. Talk a little bit about some of the new research in the microbiome, and that's one of the kind of central themes in the book. So I try to say, hey, step one for everyone, I want you to up-level how you're thinking about mental health, right? If you're still thinking just serotonin, or you're spending all your time arguing about whether meds work or not, like that's not where you should spend your time and your energy. You should spend your time and energy thinking about these new kind of three arenas, right? We think about neuroplasticity now, we think about inflammation, and we think about the microbiome when we think about mental health. So it's really striking to see a lot of these tenets. Like we talk about social isolation. Social isolation decreases the diversity of your microbiome, which tends to correlate with worse health outcomes. Right? It's like not the kind of thing we used to think about, right? In terms of how some of these aspects of our life, like how social we are, have direct biological effects on things like our inflammatory factors and our microbiome.
That's great. I love it. The social isolation piece. I think a lot of people are in this category where, as you are getting older, you're also, taking care of your parents. And whether or not you're directly taking care of your parents, or whether you are just sort of ushering them into the right sort of direction to prioritize their health, one of the biggest things that I see, and I tell all my friends, especially in like my men's group that I have, that's been really close, and we've been meeting for about 10 years now, I say, anything that you can do, especially if your parents are living on their own, maybe they've lost a partner, maybe they've been divorced, like try to get them out of being isolated is one of the most important things. And it's tough because as you get older, in a lot of ways, you get kind of used to things. Even if you don't want to be isolated, a lot of parents end up just being used to it and they don't necessarily always want to try something new that's there. But when you can regularly get a parent in something that, or anybody, doesn't even have to just be a parent, when you can regularly get them into some sort of social aspect of life, it's a complete shift in how they operate and see the world.
Oh, it's really true. My dad took up a Zoom yoga class and went from not doing yoga at all. He's 86 now. And he's got this class. He loves these guys, and they do yoga together by Zoom. He has a little like place set up in the house where he does it. And I found it very relieving because of what you're talking about. And this idea that, as we age, you certainly can kind of end up in your study, going through stuff, not really connecting with other people. And so sometimes it's something digital like that, something new that we can engage in a group or we can engage in a yoga class. I think the most powerful are when we get out and about in some way and have commitments in our schedule. I think particularly as we age, that's really important. I see my wife do a really good job of that. We moved to a new community and it's been for me like a master class in connection building. I mean, it's really been impressive to see her make sure that she's volunteering and having lunches and going on walks with people and really just making those connections and building community in a way that I've just found very inspiring. As I've been doing some of that myself, but not as impressively. But I think about that in some ways, trying to set up the next 30 years of making sure that within my community and a new community, I've got a lot of connections and I've got some commitments, things on my calendar that I'm engaging in. I just, as you're saying, as we age, it's one of those really, really important facts that I think we miss. There's so much focus right now on like living longer. And I guess I appreciate that. Okay. I don't know who kind of decided that we need more time, or that we're not doing enough with the time we have. I think one argument could be made that a lot of people maybe needing to live longer aren't maybe doing enough with the time that they have. But maybe that sounds a little judgmental. I'm sure I'll want to live longer as I'm getting older. But the notion though of really trying to fill the years you have with a depth, with an engagement, with a sense of connection, and with a sense of reality. Like in that first tenet being self-awareness. If you're 65 and isolated, right, today is a day where there is possibility for you of just doing the very first little threads of more connection. Maybe it's that you have not been leaving the house, and so you're going to go leave the house. I was working with a patient recently that was our goal. Again, it's hard for some people to kind of conceptualize that being so depressed you can't leave the house, but that's where some people are. And but you see those first threads of connection when people, it can be the littlest thing, saying hi, someone being nice. Just it kind of lights up the human spirit in a way.
What do you feel is the role of psychedelics in this process of us figuring out our mental health and up-leveling our mental health and going from mental health to mental fitness?
Okay, well, everybody, let me tell you where I am with the psychedelics, because I just want to give people my context, because I think I sound a little contrarian sometimes. Like sometimes I get, I think I sound contrarian. When I moved to Wyoming, I did some training in ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. Ketamine is a dissociative anesthetic, and if dosed correctly, gives you a brief psychedelic experience. Unlike psilocybin, where you can have journeys or trips that last, 4, 6, 8 hours, ketamine tends to be a much shorter acting. You have more of a maybe 20 minutes to 45 minutes of a kind of deeper psychedelic experience. I was very excited with all of the data coming out, and this idea that MDMA was going to get scheduled, and I wanted to prepare a clinic where we could safely give these compounds. I built a team, and we had a protocol. And I don't know what I think. I think one, the data is shifting a little bit. I think two, people haven't really paid attention to some of the costs and side effects. And one of the things that happens during psychedelic journeys is people recover memories and people recover experiences. People enter into very effusive and sometimes grandiose affective states. And so there's certainly, some powerful healing that's happening. I think there's also a lot of avoidance that's happening, and there's a flooding of the mental health field with people who don't have training in mental health that are approaching it from a kind of psychedelic perspective. I think it's also very concerning. There's a very large kind of anti-psychiatry movement within the psychedelic movement that, somehow their tickling of the 5-HT2A serotonin receptor is okay, but the ways that we get involved with serotonin and psychiatry aren't. And I think this is where I sound again a little contrarian, that I don't think people are paying attention to how complex it is to deliver psychedelic medicine effectively. To deliver a ketamine-assisted psychotherapy session is 3 to 4 hours. 2 clinicians in the space, again, because you're going to have somebody who's significantly impaired. It's just a very complex and then kind of expensive. You extend that with psilocybin to an 8-hour journey. It's just a lot of time. And then that's just the beginning, right? There's really good integration if you're doing a good protocol where you're coming and talking about what happened. I find that oftentimes there's a little less engagement in that integration. And I get concerned, that there's a big difference between psychonauts, people who want to explore their consciousness and do a lot of different substances, and mental health clinicians, those of us who are in the space to help people heal. And I think sometimes those 2 things get kind of confused. And then I think the last probably critique is there isn't really much accountability. I have a lot of patients who engage in these things, and some of the guides are great; they'll check in, but because it's kind of so illegal and underground, a lot of people are hesitant to. So then you have folks who are combining, a mix of psychotropic medications that I prescribe with a mix of psychedelic medications, and ideally we have a system where there can be better coordination. That when there are protocols that are really effective, they can be cost effective too. That's not really what's happening right now. People are generally going abroad. There's kind of this, I would say quick fix mentality, but there's a notion of like a transformational weekend. It's going to like shift things forever. And I think, certainly that happens for some people. And then I think everyone's doing these things, Dhru. So like, everybody has a kind of experience and opinion. I've certainly had experiences and informed some opinions. And so I think we need a lot more research. I think there's a concerning downside people aren't talking about. And I don't mean to fearmonger. I'm not trying to say that these things should all be illegal. I mean, I like the idea of us exploring them more and having more tools, but they're very powerful compounds. Like the idea that you're going to disrupt your default mode network and like trash, get rid of your ego. I don't know who decided that was a good idea, Dhru. I like your default mode network. It's really interesting. You're Dhru. I'm glad that there's consistency between us over the years. I don't mind if you want to disrupt it for a little while to go experience something different, or if you're suffering in some way and you get away from that, okay. But the idea that, for 2 months, your default mode network is really going to be off. I'm not, I don't know why we decided that's great. Or the ego death. I don't know. In psychiatry, we did a lot of training around what's called ego supportive psychotherapy. That your ego, in the Freudian model, the part of your mind that's kind of negotiating between these primal drives and our kind of moral and cultural and societal values, that ego strength, right, was your ability to live according to a set of values, not just to give in to our impulses, violent and sexual and aggressive and all that. I've always liked that model. This idea that my ego, like what part of what I'm working on in mental fitness is a self-awareness of my sense, my defenses, my communication style. And so I'm all for people having access to medicines that work. And I think when we're going to include psychedelics into the space, we need to be more thoughtful than we've been. And we need to keep paying attention to some of, I would say, the negative signals that we see in the space that, again, don't get talked about very much.
I think as anything is emerging, especially something that has been suppressed for such a long time, the research has been, you couldn't do research on it for a long time. Mm-hmm. Stigma around psychedelics. You couldn't even have a conversation about, exploring it. Even some of the other early people in the last few years, right? There's been different stages of it. Them even talking about it, wanting to be able to talk about it, discuss it. Even Michael Pollan talks about this in his book, is that people would look at him like, dude, why are you going there? We already know what we need to know about this stuff, right? It's not a good idea. So anytime that happens, you get the wild, wild west. Mm-hmm. And the wild, wild west sometimes though is needed. It's not, whether it's needed or not, it just ends up happening because you end up getting people that have to push the boundaries in some aspects. And then you get researchers that are fighting for, like I've had, I'm blanking on his name, the founder of MAPS on the podcast.
Rick Doblin.
Rick Doblin, right? He's seen as a very controversial figure to a lot of people because he has a lot of unique and interesting thoughts that are there. And nonetheless, he's created this organization. And sometimes I see it as like, you kind of have mad scientist explorers in every field. It's not unique to mental health. It's not unique to psychiatry. That kind of gets something going. And then the community ends up deciding how they want it to be handled. Right? Like, hey, we need more research. We need more standardization. We need more that. But sometimes these sort of fringe characters that have crazy ideas, sometimes it takes somebody a little bit out there. When I say crazy ideas, I know that's a very sort of, loaded word. I mean, different than what people who are more established in the space. Because I think sometimes people who are more established would say they wouldn't even have thought to go down that route of looking into MDMA or ketamine or other things. Sometimes you need a little bit of a pioneer, even if that pioneer is not everybody's cup of tea. And then, it's up to the community to decide, like, how do we want to handle this, right? How do we want to create better ways of not stigmatizing anything, or actually what's the most safest way to do this? Or how do we get the, government to support research? So that's just my defense of the person who's a little bit of the wild, wild west cowboy character.
Yeah. I mean,
it's just, you look through history, we've always had people like that to kind of get something going when something has been, a field that people don't want to touch for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a few folks in the space who do really deserve some accolades around the notion of being disruptors, right? When we think about Paul Stamets and his dedication to just mushrooms and mushroom cultivation and the celebration of that, and just what a cool, nerdy, interesting guy he is around this, or Rick Doblin, who, it's interesting, Rick, to my knowledge, isn't a mental health clinician in any way. And, has been really toiling for decades, again, trying to get more research, trying to get more access. And so, I think certainly will go down in history as somebody who has helped shake the space up. There are hundreds of psychedelic compounds in development now. I mean, every major medical center is thinking about this. I think Utah, oddly enough, but Utah has this wonderful mental health center, the Huntsman Mental Health Center. And Utah, the governor has allowed them to research MDMA and psilocybin, I think about a year and a half ago. And so, I think also part of what you're speaking about is how those of us who've been in the field in a certain way get a little bit defensive. And I think that's in part because we've been through many different iterations of this. There's a new medicine, there's a new therapy, there's something new for our patients. And sometimes that's great. That works. I saw that happen. There was a whole new medication class for the psychotic disorders that came out when I was in residency. And, you get very hopeful. And then you see the reality. It maybe helps some people as a promise, maybe not so much others. And so I think that where I sound a little contrarian with the psychedelics is where they get treated in an anti-psychiatry way, duh, you just need some MDMA. And,
sure.
and I just find that to be a little offensive in the face of the complexity of how mental health problems get handled. And then I also think sometimes disrupting people's minds in the way that these compounds tend to do might not help with some types of healing as much as we think.
Oh man, I had a friend from England who was like really wanting to do, she was coming to a trip to Los Angeles. And this friend, she had a lot of, trauma in her life. She lost her mom through a battle of cancer. And it in particular really weighed on her because she was alternative healthcare licensed, but alternative healthcare practitioner in England, and felt like, how could this happen to my mom? And, she really tried very hard to bring her to a lot of these more experimental treatments in Germany, these medical centers that were there, and just really felt bummed about the whole situation, that not just her mom passing, but just the fact that on top of that, the idea that like she was really the daughter, but also kind of like trying to be the mom's advocate for health, right? And anybody can imagine that's like devastating enough to lose your mom, but then partly you feeling like, hey, I was responsible. If I knew better, I would have figured something out, right? That's just her thought. Whether that's true or not is a different situation. And she said, I'm coming out to LA, I really want to. And it had been years since her mom passed away, and there was a few other things that were there. I really want to have like a psychedelic experience. And this was in like 2012. And me, I didn't even grow up really drinking, right? I didn't like the taste of alcohol, all this stuff. I never smoked weed. I didn't have anything against it, but it was like, hey, this isn't for me. And I don't feel like drawn to these things.
This like seemed like unhealthy behaviors to you?
I don't even know if I thought alcohol was unhealthy. I just thought like, I don't get it. Huh. Right. And maybe, I didn't feel like I really got it. So anyways, long story short, I messaged a friend and said, hey, listen, she's interested. Like, I don't know, like maybe let's try to create a little bit of like an intentional setting at our place. And, if some people want to have some, magic mushrooms and, have that. And again, this is just, no understanding. Like I've had some really incredible people on this podcast that are like researchers in the space, but this is just like, oh, we're just all friends, doing some mushrooms. Right. And man, she had such a bad trip. And since that time period, she's never been the same. And this is an extreme situation. I think there's some other factors that play into it. This is an individual that probably was abusing marijuana. And I'm like very nervous about especially the abuse of marijuana these days. I've had multiple people in my life who seem to have, weed-induced schizophrenia.
I wouldn't say seem to. I mean, that's the major risk with cannabis, especially in adolescence and late adolescence. So totally. Let's say 16 to 25 is psychosis. I mean, the risk for psychosis and psychotic disorders just skyrockets if you're using cannabis, and generally thought to be like quote, very safe. And if you look at the long-term data, besides psychosis, reasonably, although there's just a big signal for increased risk of heart disease for cannabis users, but heavy cannabis users. And I think, you're here in California where there's just been, there's a proliferation of, both access, but then concentrations. And so anyway.
Yeah. So kind of a few different layers that were there. Obviously she had a multitude of things going on. I've had plenty of people, that have had psychedelic experiences, myself included. I've shared on the podcast, but 2 years ago, I took my parents to a guided psilocybin journey that was in Maui with a group that had, regularly does this, where everybody had support. There's a protocol, heavy focus on integration. The whole thing's like really done well, recommended by a multitude of people. And it wasn't for anything that was wrong. It was to have that journey and experience together. And
what was it like? How old were your folks when they did this?
My dad just had turned 70.
And they're both like,
sorry, my dad had just turned 74 and my mom was just about to turn 70.
Okay.
And they had never done anything like this before. They don't even drink alcohol.
Yeah.
I'd taken psilocybin one time previously prior to that, but nothing like, it was more like a very small dose.
What was their intrigue with it?
Their intrigue is they've heard, man, I didn't take my nootropics this morning, so I'm blanking on a bunch. The gentleman from Johns Hopkins who passed away.
Right. Roland Griffiths.
Griffiths. I've had him on the podcast and I've had a few other people on the podcast. I had him on the podcast before he passed away. He was at the Functional Medicine Conference a few years ago, got a chance to sit with him and interview him. And my parents listened to this podcast and they thought, wow, this is something, interesting. And at that time too, I believe it was Michael Pollan's Netflix documentary had just come out. And I was sharing that I was interested in having the experience, and for a multitude of reasons. And they said, you know what, if you do it and you find a place that, is recommended, we would love to do that as well. So there was a curiosity that was there. And I would say that the real driver is one of the main things that Roland Griffith's research showed. I mean, he's done a bunch of it, was in their national survey on psychedelic, people who've had a psychedelic experience. He showed that, I think it was like 5 to 7% of them had a bad trip. And most of those was in a setting that was not a safe setting, was a party setting. It was combined with alcohol, other things like that. But for the people that had a good trip, one of the biggest takeaways was people said it was the most mystical experience of their life. And my parents are very into their Hindu tradition, which is a tradition of not just religion, but mysticism. And I think that idea drew them in of like, wow, if people are saying that this is the most mystical experience of their life, what would that experience look like for them? What would come to them? So we all went to Hawaii. A couple of my friends, my wife came as well, my parents. And first of all, everybody's saying, oh my God, the fact that your parents are doing this, like that's like wild. Like our parents would never do it.
I think that's why I sound like such a jerk about the psychedelics, is because I think I wouldn't call it jealousy, but there's a way that like, it's just more fun. The idea that like you and your parents would like come to like maybe an intensive to like, connect or, talk about mysticism or explore, something that's more traditional mental health, doesn't have this like grin or excitement that there's something about the psychedelics that gets people jazzed up about engaging with their mental health in a way.
Yeah.
Right? To go in, it's like, and I think it's because it's an active experience. I felt this as a clinician where I'm used to an experience. You come and you sit down and, you're running the ship. Like you want to talk about, your background, your development, what happened yesterday, your dream. I mean, it's like, I want to hear what's on your mind. With psychedelics, it's different because you're inducing something and you don't know if it's going to be good or bad. You don't know in an hour if the patient's going to be throwing up or whether they're going to be having a deep mystical experience. And there's something about that, I think, as a clinician, going from this kind of maybe more passive receptive stance, right? Where the only thing I'm really giving are interpretations, maybe some food prescription, a little mental fitness prescription, maybe some meds, to you're going to have this experience. And it could be a profound experience that is with you for the rest of your life, a transcender, or it might be kind of a bad, dark experience, ranging from like, I don't quite get the dosing right, to just, this isn't a good medicine for you. And it's a very different stance as a clinician. But I think what you're demonstrating is, boy, it's just, it's more fun and it's a more active way of engaging with our mental health. And I think I
don't even know if that's what I'm saying. I think that there's different tools for different toolboxes. So one thing is, shout out to the group that was there that was doing it. They screen everybody for, look, if you got something major going on in your life or you're dealing with depression, there's other people that are there that might be there for you, right? This is not the experience that's there for you. It was people that had a lot of clinical experience, but they're not in your boat where they're like, their main thing is to be working with somebody who's depressed or dealing with some severe PTSD, although they did have a lot of experience working with veterans that were there with a different, combining with a different group that they had support with. And so our thing was like, it was more the thing that with my parents, my brother-in-law was there and my wife was there. It was more of a, hey, we're all good. Like we have good mental, nobody's working through something right now. And it's more that this is a mystical experience that we want to have together. Right. But, I don't think that that's the right fit for a lot of people. And I think that there's a lot. And the crazy thing is that here, especially in Los Angeles, I'm always amazed when I go to like events or a dinner party and somebody's like, oh yeah, we're going to do, just some like major dose of, ayahuasca or psilocybin or something just like off the cuff this weekend. And they did it a few weekends before. And I'm just like, man, after I had that experience, I didn't have the draw to even want to, I felt like good for a while.
It's a great point also about
I felt great. And I think that goes back to this. There's a lot of maybe escapism or other stuff or reliance. I'm not going to have any judgments on anything, but I am excited about the fact that one thing that seems even as controversial as an individual as you might be to some people, and a lot of people on my podcast, you know, they listen from all walks of the political aisle. So people don't even like me mentioning this sometimes, but I'm still going to mention it. I think one of the things about having Secretary Bobby Kennedy in is it does seem on the roadmap, there is some hint to opening up more traditional research dollars to this whole area of therapeutic usage of the spectrum of psychedelics that might be there. And I think that that's one thing that I am actually really excited about, because I think we need more places like where I can tell a friend who's dealing with depression, hey, not just go see, you know, Dr. Ramsey, but also if you decide that it's a good fit, maybe one of these tools in the toolbox, that you don't have to be doing it underground, and they're going to get a much better treatment and experience through you than, you know, trying to go to some sort of weekend retreat that's out there.
You know, how we figure out the right research to really understand how these compounds work, and do they work better? And I think that's the other part that, you know, right now I think the efficacy looks about equal. And so
for some things, right? MDMA, the efficacy for that, for people that have been dealing with post-traumatic stress, right? Is much higher than a lot of the PTSD options that are out there.
The PTSD is a data that I think, you know, as a space where the data stands out, right? That MDMA is showing some, you know, more robust results than anything else has. I think psilocybin for alcohol use disorder was very exciting. I think, you know, part of what you're talking about is how do we kind of keep this cutting edge moving forward with research, but also give people access. It's very frustrating to be a veteran right now with severe PTSD who's done a great job. So many of my patients do such a great job. They try so many things. They're really like working hard to get their mental health better, and we are letting them down. So the idea that someone in this situation, one of our veterans, you know, who's struggling with PTSD, maybe suicidal, has to then like fly to Jamaica and go to some retreat, spending thousands of dollars, as opposed to being able to access something that, the thing about psychedelics, they work quickly. That's I remember I had a patient in Wyoming that was just really, really, you know, struggling down, and I'm sitting there with her, and I was like, you should come back tomorrow and let's give you a ketamine journey, because you know, the next day she was feeling better. Like when it works quickly. And there's a lot of tolerance of suffering that we have. There's a lot of people not getting all the way better. And so I like the idea that we have better access. I like the idea of it coming above ground. You know, what's horrible right now is all of the underground guides are terrified because they're breaking the law. Because of that, you also then have real questions about supply and supply safety and quality, right? What are people actually taking? And then on top of all that, you kind of have the question of like, who's the right person to give these compounds? You know, like I said, I think I sound a little bit like a jerk about this, so I'm not sure it's me. Although I certainly want, if they work, for my patients to be involved with their care in that way. And so I think and you know, we'll see. In terms of the new administration, we'll see. I hold those in charge to a very high standard when it comes to our health. And I've always been concerned whenever our healthcare is directed by anyone who's not a physician, because I think physicians think differently. We just think differently about health, and have been in it in a way that it just shifts how you think about these things.
Yeah. Well, we do have a long history. Previous, you know, heads of HSS been lawyers and other stuff and things like that. But, you know, we'll leave that. I
always think it's a bad idea. I think anybody who's running healthcare in America, NIMH, HHS, I just think we want a physician in charge. And I know there's a long history of other. I just think that, again, it's a perspective that's different, because all other fields think about health, think about the kind of humanity and ethics of healthcare just differently than physicians.
So here's where I would push back just a little bit on that, right? Just because it's a podcast, we can do that. We can have this great conversation. I want all the perspectives.
Let's do it.
I think where you have the other side of it is that you have people that are like the head of the FDA, and then it's like they're regulating things that are directly related to pharmaceuticals. And you have this revolving door where you have somebody then is a physician and sometimes not a physician, and then goes and leaves and then goes and works for Pfizer, right? Or goes and works for Merck. We've seen that many times over. So I see it as like, let's judge each individual person as a person. I don't see any history that physicians are human beings, right? I don't see any history of there's something that would make a physician more so wanting to keep that perspective. I think when you have any kind of influence that can kind of cloud the waters and corruption can kind of come in, regardless of where people are coming from, you'll see that corruption come in. And I don't think physicians are immune. And I don't think physicians can be, are uniquely immune from that. I think they're just human beings, just like everybody else.
It's not that physicians are less prone to bias. I think it's that physicians in general tend to be a little bit more tuned into it. And the revolving door thing, I don't think is exclusive to physicians. I think it's where you're speaking about a system we have where there's an interplay between regulation and commercial industry. And that's true in all aspects of the government, whether it's the Pentagon or whether it's the FDA. I'm a simple clinician, Dhru. I take care of patients on all sides of the political spectrum. It's really been important to me throughout my career that no matter where you are in your political beliefs, that I can care for you.
Yeah.
That my job is that if you have depression, anxiety, a substance use concern, that you can come to me and you will feel you're taking a step towards healing. So that's I think important part of again, improving healthcare in our country. I think what probably everyone agrees with is that things have not been going well. We have a very expensive system that doesn't work very well for a lot of people. I don't know anyone who feels satisfied with the healthcare system or with the mental healthcare system. I know, like people from all types of echelons of power who need help and don't know where to find a couples therapist, a psychiatrist, don't know even the next step to take care of their mental health. And so I do hope we end up with something much better than what we have.
Yeah. Well, I'm team human, and I've seen, anytime humanity deals with these various versions of crises, especially here in America, like I feel like we'll figure it out. We'll figure it out together. And we can't, going back to something you mentioned earlier, you mentioned that you're really focused on what the individual can do, right? Like the food system might be corrupt. There might be big companies that are pursuing profits. Politics can swing this way or that way, but at the end of the day, what are the things, the core tenets that people who are listening can do? And I think that 100% that is first and fundamental, because if we're not an example in our own life, if we're not sleeping better, if we're not eating better, if we're not then, trying to help the people that are around us, it's like all change really starts from there.
Mm-hmm.
So let's bring it back to the book.
Okay.
I love that tangent that we went on, and thank you for talking about
Dhru,
psychedelics and everything else.
I appreciate you asking me about it, and I'm always working to, it's a lot. I was thinking it's just a lot. Between the nutritional psychiatry data, the traditional psychiatry data, the psychedelic data, running a practice of just the reality of keeping up on all the meds that you prescribe, and all the psychotherapy research. It just it ends up being a lot, and it's a great challenge to keep up with it. But, I hope what everybody listening hears is my encouragement to explore, and I think a little bit of my caution. I think there's hyperbole. It's the same way that I just think, having given a lot of psychotropic substances throughout my career, it's like we need to approach all this with much more humility. Yeah,
well said. Let's come back to the book, especially right now. Who should be reading this book?
This book is for anyone who feels they need to do more for their mental health. If you have concerns, this isn't a book really for necessarily for anyone who is currently struggling. I think it is helpful. Certainly these tenets are supportive of any type of mental health treatment because they're the foundations of kind of the self-care that we need to do to engage with our mental health and improve our mental fitness. I think who I hope is for, and ideally people who will find it, again, are people who want to engage with the self to improve it. And maybe that's too general and not focused enough. This book is for women between 35 and 65, but it's the truth. And I think we're also in an era where, more than ever, men are engaging with their mental health. You've mentioned your men's group a couple of times, which is just awesome. I'm super jealous of that.
We actually have a retreat this weekend. We leave tomorrow.
Oh my gosh. I want to hide in your trunk and come along. It sounds incredible. But, the kind of thing that people didn't really do in the past that much. Occasionally, you'd see maybe a men's group at a church function or as part of work. But, we're seeing more and more people get engaged with their mental health, think about their mental fitness. And so, this book is really for men and women who are thinking about needing to make some changes and I guess wanting some framework. It's easy to say I'm going to work on my mental health, or every May we have Mental Health Awareness Month, which I love. As one of my patients said to me years ago, awareness without action doesn't do much for us. It really struck me. I was like, it's easy for us to feel we're fighting stigma. But with the example you gave around food, you buy lentils or you don't. You cook lentils at home or you don't. And I don't mean that in a judgmental or accusatory way. It's just we can complain about the food system and how horrible it is, but there are lentils in your grocery store. There's kale in your grocery store. There are a bevy of the foods that you need that are good for your health in your grocery store. And so I kind of get to this question is what's getting in your way? What are the barriers that you're facing to incorporating these foods into your life? Because that's where the change happens.
Yeah, absolutely. Talk a little bit about your world. You have a podcast that you launched since the last time that we talked.
Yeah, we got the Dr. Dhru Ramsey podcast. I just wanted a space to talk about all things mental health and mental fitness, whether it are episodes on the gut microbiome and, or whether thinking about inflammation or they're talking to inspirational figures. I wanted a space to ask people what they're doing for their mental health and to have some inspiring examples. Dhru, my world is really involved in clinical care. I spend maybe 30 to 40 hours a week taking care of patients. And I just really love that work. I'm very happy in a psychotherapy session with all of the associations flowing around, trying to understand what's going on, understand how I can be helpful. We've got an e-course that goes with the book, Healing the Modern Brain. It's up on my website. And so really just try to give people a lot of tools, whether it's some downloads on some of my favorite antidepressant foods that are surprising, or the ultimate mental fitness morning of kind of how to get your day started to really live by the tenets of mental fitness. But yeah, I think, that, and then I'm adapting to living a mile up. We're at 6,250 feet in Jackson and living in a place where it snows pretty much every month, maybe not July or August, but also being in just a wonderful new community. A lot of these mountain towns like Jackson and Vail and Aspen have massive mental health crises. Part of what actually drew me to the place as we were looking for kind of the next spot for our family was thinking about a place that really valued mental health. And Jackson was fascinating. They'd already done a community survey of thousands of people in the community, kind of better defining the mental health problem there, significant problem with alcohol use, significant problem with social isolation. But it was just very, my world in some ways is trying to understand more about being in a community, being of service to that community as a psychiatrist, trying to, continue to settle in and build connections. And then, a lot of my life is about being a dad and a husband, just the day in, day out of that, and trying to, with all these other things we've mentioned, I find that's in some ways the most important, and at times, I wouldn't say elusive, but it's really easy for the rest of the stuff to eat your day. And, and it's easy for all of us to get too busy and say that, but boy, when I get focused and get to spend some time with my wife and kids, that's when I ask what else is going on, that's certainly a big part of it for me.
I love it. Well, the book is, depending on the day that we air, it'll either be pre-order or order.
Okay. I hope you'll do both.
I hope we'll do both. Well, depending on the day that the podcast comes out, so you can either get it right now or you can pre-order it. Healing the Modern Brain. We have the link in the show notes below. Dr. Ramsey, thanks for coming back on the podcast. It's so much more fun to do in person.
Drew, it's awesome to see. I was a little nervous for it. I haven't done an in-person podcast in a while, but it's a treat to be with you, man. I really appreciate all of your support. People don't know this, but years and years ago, I was at this conference called Wanderlust, and I think Palm Springs, and I sat down with Drew, and I'd just done maybe my second book. And Drew sat down with me. It's this like beautiful, leafy outdoor patio. My wife actually still remembers it. And we sat down there for about an hour, and you were so kind and so generous and so encouraging. And it sticks with me, man. I don't think this book would be here without folks like yourself encouraging me and giving me a platform to come and speak and valuing my opinion. So it's a real treat to come back and a real touchstone for me. So thank you, my friend.
Thank you, brother. Appreciate it. Anytime. Hey, YouTube, if you enjoyed what you just saw, keep watching for more great content on how to improve your brain and your life.
Diet, exercise or movement, sleep, managing substance use, stress reduction or relaxation. Those are the basic ingredients for human health.